It comes like a fleeting memory. Whatever you grab just turns to dust. Like eye contact with a stranger in a crowded room. Is a dream begging to reveal. The passing note of a song.
Are we ready?
Let's just go there.
You want to go there?
Yeah, to the shores.
To the shores.
Welcome, everyone.
Welcome. I don't know where we're going this evening, but I'm positive we'll get there.
We'll get there, yeah, totally.
I've been thinking a lot about the analogy of the shores of ignorance and how sometimes I feel bad that we don't prepare a show, prepare a set of topics. I mean, sometimes we'll have something we want to talk about, but then I remembered that that's the whole point of this show is we're going to the shores of ignorance. We're going to where we're ignorant and finding beauty in that space. It doesn't really matter whether or not we have something prepared.
Yeah. Well, I think that's something I enjoy about our conversation in general is kind of taking the deep dive into something unknown and you're kind of working through it and piecing through it. And I think some of the comments we've kind of gotten is like, what are you guys saying? And a lot of it is we're figuring that out as we go. And I think that's the important part of our conversation is that, you know, we're working these things out. And also when we listen to all the experts and stuff that we listen to, it's like we want to understand and discuss like what we're hearing and does that sound right to you? And you know, kind of go back and forth. So
what was it? I think it was a Jordan Peterson quote where he said, "Truth is the handmaiden of love, and discourse is the way to truth." Conversation, discourse, that's how we discover what's true. And that's in service of love. Yeah. It was really beautiful the way he said it. Maybe I'll look it up.
I wonder why it's in service to love. Like it seems kind of, like I feel like I get it, like when you say that, but at the same time, well, I guess in discourse, you're trying to make a connection, a relational connection to different aspects. And like when two people fall in love, it's kind of maybe the epitome of making that connection of discourse. And I mean, that's kind of where I would go with it.
I was trying to find the quote, but I can't find it. It's close enough. I think it's in service of love because a point we've been hitting on, or we seem to keep coming back to is, you know, what is truth? If you think of truth as a set of facts, well, you know, those facts could be true, but it isn't until they're employed in a story that they're meaningful. Things can be true, but arbitrary. Yeah. And that's why it's in service of love. Because truth is what points to love. And things that are true that don't point to love need to find a different part in the story. Yeah. If you're just simply engaging in discourse to discover true facts, it's a bit like a little kid's rock collection. It's all arbitrary and doesn't mean very much. And years later, their parents are going to, this is a real life story. Years later, their parents are going to hand that kid a big bucket of rocks and it's just rocks, you know? Yeah, they're rocks. That's true. But it doesn't really mean much.
Yeah, I mean, unless each one of those rocks had something that represents something in your life. Like, oh, I got this from the beach of Ojinaga or, you know, from the mountains of Zurich or something like that.
Right. Well, and if that's important and meaningful, then you would somehow have that story attached to those items through some kind of curated exhibit. Yeah. You know, or you do something with them, you mount them to tell the story, or you arrange them in such a way that there's some hint at meaning.
Yeah. Would you ever find yourself, so for the most part, I kind of find myself in, like I have a sort of framework I work in, and then ever so often something will kind of pop me out of that framework and you kind of feel outside of that sort of the reality you thought you were living in. So like, for example, like I have a sort of business reality that I live in. And then whenever I come home, I'm like, oh, wait, I also have this family reality that I live in. And you start sort of stacking these on top of each other, and they seem to kind of prioritize themselves, or even fill in the other ones. Like whenever it comes down to brass tacks, my family is more important than the business. They're who I'm going to be with forever, and my business may come and go, but my family is someone that I'm going to have for the rest of my life.
Yeah,
and. I also find that too. Like sometimes I'll be walking home and I'll be thinking about something and really stumped and just, racking my brain about something. And then sort of like a breeze or a bird or something will kind of pop you out. And you're like, oh, yeah, I just need to kind of appreciate the little things in life and not, I just kind of, those types of things kind of, it just makes me think I don't really see things as they are. And however, there's a certain, as you go through the years and mature, there's sort of a framework that you build that kind of gets bigger and bigger, hopefully, but I always feel kind of like it's still not enough.
I mean, that's a very common experience, I think, that if you're trying to solve a problem, you're giving it your focused attention. And attention has the power to transform things, but also the aspect of attention that allows it to transform things via problem solving, for example, is that it's focused, it's limited, it doesn't see everything. Like, as you said, it doesn't see things as they are. It sees the part of them that it's attending to. And so you're working on a problem and you're stumped, you go outside and you take a walk, and your mind starts focusing on other things, the birds, the breeze, as you said. And suddenly some part of your brain goes, oh, there's the solution to the problem I was working on.
It seems like that's how most discoveries are made. You always hear that story of sitting in the bathtub and then, oh, displacement of water.
Right.
Oh, that's how we can find the weight of gold, or the, I forget what the specific.
I don't know what
was.
that is.
Yeah, I think that's something that.
Yeah, to try to bring back in the word you started with, framework. Our frameworks aren't complete for the tasks that we're trying to accomplish. If the frameworks were complete, then there wouldn't be really anything to work on to accomplish. And so we're constantly out. We're constantly beyond our own ability. At least when the work is good, you're working on something that's beyond your understanding, and you're learning. And you don't know what part of the framework is insufficient, and so you do need that, as you said, pop out, so that you can see things from a different perspective and figure out what part of your framework is insufficient.
As you were saying, that made me think of. Tell me if this is the extremes of this, that on one side, you're continually trying to break the framework. And it's almost like, when you hear someone say that they sabotage themselves, sort of something's working well, sort of some framework is working well. And so you kind of sabotage yourself because you don't feel worthy, or, could be angry at the world, and anything that works well, you don't. It just reminds you of good things. And then on the other side, where you have a framework that you stick to no matter what, and you get kind of stuck in your ways. It's like, would you say those are like maybe the two bookends of that sort of the middle way of being able to function in a way that your frameworks are being deconstructed, and you're also constructing new frameworks. Like, it seems like there's a process there between those two worlds, but then you can also spiral into maybe the perversions or extremes of those. Would you say that maybe is extremes of that?
I mean, it seems like a very archetypally true thing. You need the frameworks that you aren't supposed to touch because you need that stability. I mean, that's the island. And then you need the frameworks that are incomplete, and that's the shore, so that you can encounter what you don't know, which is the sea, the ignorance.
Yeah.
And so you've got to protect the island, otherwise you don't have anywhere to live. But you also have to tend to the shores and spend time there, otherwise you don't ever learn. What did you say? You said something about self-sabotage?
Yeah, I kind of I was talking with Austin about this a little bit, my son, and we were just talking about how, sometimes like he feels like he almost kind of feels like he self-sabotages himself, like he's doing really well, and then something in him just shuts down, and it just feels like I could keep doing this, but I'm not going to, and therefore it almost puts it as if he is the one doing it, but it's almost as if it's being done to him.
It's really awesome that he can see that and articulate it.
Oh, they had to read Crime and Punishment, and he made this freaking, I was just like, he was having a tough time this week, and I forgot the character's name, but he noticed in the book that a lot of these other characters that did these crimes and stuff like that, they didn't ask for help or being willing to accept help. But this one character was willing to accept help, even though he kept pushing him away. It's like he was one, and actually he made it through. And I was just thanking that our school are reading such great literature in that way, because something in that story made him say, "Hey, Dad, I need help."
That's awesome.
And then he was able to articulate it better than I can right now on a podcast. So I'm 45 years old.
Yeah.
And I was just like, wow, dude, that's like really profound. Like it was we had such a great conversation after that. We started talking about libertarianism and conservatism, liberalism, and how people are like, that's one observation he made is like, he's like, it's really hard to talk with people. Like, it was kind of great because he's like, I like talking to you, Dad, because like you don't judge quickly, or I forgot how he said it. But he's like, it's like whenever I have these conversations with other people, it's like they're so strict in what they think that they're not willing to entertain other ideas.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting for him as a 16-year-old seeing that. I mean, I guess really young people are supposed to do that, but still to notice it.
So many people, I think, when you talk to them, as they're listening, they're planning what they're going to say next. And that's not really a real conversation.
Yeah.
I think that's something, it's actually a skill to listen, to silence yourself and actually listen and consider what the other person is saying.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that you are inherently good at, in part because you're just deeply curious. But it's so cool that your son noticed that and could say, yeah, I notice other people don't. They just want to say what they have to say. They don't want to entertain anything new. And when I talk to you, Dad, I can play because you're actually interested in what I have to say and what I think.
Yeah.
It's like, what a blessing. I think like I had that with my dad, but I think a lot of people don't with their parents, especially with parents, because now that I'm a parent, one thing that I struggle with all the time is like, I don't know how to talk to my kids. And I'm anxious about that and self-conscious about it all the time. Because I'm simultaneously supposed to raise them and protect them, but also teach them. But I also want to know them.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out how to traverse that complicated landscape, even just in, a 15-minute car ride to school is really difficult. So I think a lot of parents just sort of opt out. They say, I'm going to make sure you do what I think you should do. And beyond that, I don't really know how to deal with you. I don't know how to get to know you.
Which makes sense. I mean, just on a parenting side is that, almost every parent feels like a failure of some sort, Like, I don't know a parent that's like, man, I'm totally kicking ass.
Yeah, right.
If so,
I'm an awesome parent.
Yeah, let me meet them for sure.
It's funny. I can't really imagine anyone saying that.
Yeah.
And there's surely some narcissistic and arrogant people that you've run into in your life, but even those kinds of people, I can't imagine saying, "Oh yeah, I'm an awesome parent."
Yeah.
I wonder what it is that makes us sober about that.
It is something about kids reflect the best and the worst of you. You know, I think that's something that seems to be kind of true.
Well, and I feel like, yes, and kids see you deeply, a lot more deeply than most of the other people in your life. And so if you were to say to one of your kids, "I'm a really great dad," they'd probably just laugh at you. Like, it's so obviously not true, even though it is true. It's like it's true, but it's not true. And that's true of everyone.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me that there's sort of, I've been thinking about death and how weird it is that death is inevitable. And yet, when someone in your life dies, you feel bewildered. How can you know something is going to happen and then feel bewildered when it happens? And a sort of similar truth is, like, if there's, two constants in the species, it's death and birth.
Taxes.
Death and taxes. Well, death and birth.
Yeah.
People are going to be born. Most people are going to be parents. And yet we don't know how to deal with death, and we don't know how to deal with parenting. It seems like we don't get better at those things, which is odd because we've been evolving for 500 million years? And there's no manual for how to be a parent.
Yeah.
And there's no manual for how to deal with the grief of the loss of a loved one, despite the fact that you knew with 100% certainty that it was going to happen. There's no way to prepare for it. That's strange to me. And maybe it has something to do with the relational aspect of life. Every child is different. Every parent is different. Every death is different. What can you extract out of those that's helpful as the generations move on? Maybe those are two of the most meaningful things in our lives that will ever happen. How do you condense that into some sort of shorthand knowledge that you can sort of say, well, this is how we deal with death and this is how we deal with parenting? It's always going to be wrong.
It does seem like we have, there's aspects of this that are embedded in our culture. Muslims deal with death in a certain way, Jews in a way, Christians do, Hindus.
Right.
It's there's all these sort of ceremonies around death, and I would say prior to the modern age, death was maybe a little bit more incorporated into a life than it is today.
Do you think that our modern culture tries to hide itself from death or hide death from relevancy in some sense?
It kind of reminds me of the book, The Giver, is that at some point the elderly sort of get moved out of the culture. And so no one really has dealt with death actually, because by the time somebody kind of starts moving into that territory, whatever that means, closer to death, it's they're no longer part of the regular community. And I think a part of that is, at least in the West, I think that's kind of how our culture sort of functions is, they're no longer useful. And so we kind of push them to the side.
Like to a nursing home or
to
something?
To a nursing home, out of mind, out of sight kind of thing. And again, I think I'm speaking a little bit too extreme, but it does seem like we do have a tendency to do that and celebrate youth and not celebrate our elders as much as we do our youth. Maybe it's because we have like 80-year-olds leading the nation that shouldn't be leading the nation. That's a whole other topic.
Well, I don't really want the young Instagram influencers leading the nation either.
No, that's true. Yeah. But it's interesting. I mean, up to your dad passing, how did you think about death, or was death a part of your, not with him specifically, but was that something that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I thought about the inevitability of it, and I was aware that my parents were going to die. And I was afraid of that loss for a long time. But I don't really understand the question. Maybe it's like, did you think about death? What does that mean?
Well, okay. Well, I just came across this. I was reading about Stoicism, and there's a sort of idea. I forgot which Stoic talks about this. It could have been Zeno, or what's his name, Socrates, or something like that. But something that gives you a better framework is sometimes thinking of what's the worst thing you could think that could happen, and you always kind of prepare yourself because you've already thought about the worst thing that could happen, and if you lost everything today, like what would you do? Like how would that impact you? And you kind of walk through those scenarios in your head as far as, and it's not that you can match what that scenario is perfectly, but there's something about how we can project into the future and see ourselves and how we would handle that, or guess how we would handle it. I know that's something that always goes through my head as far as like, if this happened, like how would I react, or why would I react that way, or what's, why is that important, or, whatever it might be. Like business is one way I think of that is, what's the worst thing that could happen? I lose everything. Okay. So I move into an apartment. You
imagine how life would go on after that.
Yeah. And I mean, I have no idea. I've got certain things that I think about in this area, but I don't think it's necessarily, I don't know if it's good or healthy. But I do think about that as like, if my mom passed today, like what would that look like? And what would I be thankful for? Or, what do I need to do today? I don't think I asked that one as much, to be honest.
I think it's important that death be an understood and looked at part of life, because death is a part of life. And we do seem to want to get rid of death, either whether it's Ray Kurzweil trying to get us to artificial intelligence so that he can live forever, upload his consciousness into the cloud and, re-meet his dad or something like that. Or for some reason I think about like the vegan movement is like totally against the death of animals. Like we have some idea that it would be possible to prevent death, whether by choice or technology. But it's inevitable for every creature and for every individual. Like we need to have a relationship with that. I mean, it definitely seems unhealthy to try to pretend like that can be controlled, because it can't. Yeah.
Well, I think there's also a difference between, just on the death topic still, like that when something happens suddenly or like out of time, it's like your kid dies or something like that. Like, like that's, you have this vision of them you passing away before they do.
Right.
As well as them having a long life of some years, or your parent seemed healthy and then they're not.
Yeah.
And so there's there's a little bit of like a joltingness because of the suddenness of it. Outside of you see your parent or somebody pass away slowly, it's like it's more of like you're able to sort of like experientially go there, and it's like more gentle, maybe.
Yeah. I had a really close friend die when we were 20 years old. I had known him since I was like 7, and he died of a pulmonary embolism, I think. One night we were all just hanging out, and he just was bouncing around, kind of like a hyper college kid, and he passed out and fell down, and we went to the hospital, and he passed away. And it definitely feels like when a young person dies, there's something extremely unfair that's occurred. Like something's been stolen from you.
Yeah.
It's hard to understand because young people aren't supposed to die. They're supposed to live, right?
Yeah.
But then again, when my last grandmother died, the last of my 4 grandparents, she was 94 years old and was at the end of a long struggle with dementia and whatever else comes along with that. And even still, when she died, it felt like something had been taken from me. I don't know that you ever don't feel that way. I mean, maybe it's more pronounced when the loss is of a younger person, but death seems to, you tend to feel like something's been stolen. Maybe with my grandmother, it was partly like the last of that generation in my life. I felt a hole there, some place that she occupied, the last holdout of that generation in my family lineage.
Yeah, it's hard. I'm trying not to be like insensitive in this area because I do agree with you, and yet something that bothers me a little bit, as far as like we're part of like, I think it's why I like epic stories where it could even deal with generations or over long periods of time, you see a story develop. Or you take the Bible, for example, you see, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're passing away, but you see this lineage moving into the future too. And they don't get to experience that. And yet they're also a part of that, lineage moving into the future. And maybe it's something that I think Judaism does this really well about sort of honoring their fathers, whether it be, every Passover, the honoring the Exodus from Egypt, and there's a lot of remembering, and it talks about how they took Joseph's bones from Exodus and brought it into the promised land, and there's something about remembering your forefathers, and like it's almost like there's also a part of like that will be me one day. Like I will be the one who passes, and what am I going to leave my children, and what's going to go with them into the future?
Do you think once you've passed, do you think about how your descendants will remember you?
I'd be curious. I mean, I think I would love to make at least enough of a splash that they remember me for a couple of generations.
Yeah.
It's like I would love for, if I never got to meet my grandkids or something, it's like I would love for my kids to be able to tell them about me, or my grandkids get to tell their kids about me if I'm not there,
Right.
So there is something, maybe it's selfish or maybe I think it's important that we do honor our parents and our forefathers and mothers that came before us.
So on my dad's side of the family, the story of our forefathers ends with my grandfather's father.
Okay.
So that's 3 generations back.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very far.
No.
And it ends because that man was apparently an alcoholic really badly. And my grandfather left home at something like 10 or 11 years old and never, to my understanding, had much of a relationship with him after that. But on my mother's side, the stories go back a lot farther. I think it's like my great grandfather, 3 or 4 greats, was a part of the Oklahoma land rush. And he and his wife, got into a canvas covered wagon and rode out west and basically picked out some land, and he built a house. When he died, the obituary read, his name was Zedekiah True.
That's just a badass name.
Yeah. And the obituary read, Zedekiah was the kind of man whom you could send into the woods with nothing but an axe, and he would have a homestead established within 2 months or something like that.
That's awesome.
It's pretty badass.
Well, so this might be anecdotal, but that's interesting juxtaposition between an alcoholic father whose son leaves to get away from that versus someone who was useful with their hands and built something. Built
a place for the stories to be passed down into, or for the people to be safe in, such that the stories could be told.
Yeah. This is really interesting. It'd be kind of cool to pick that apart a little bit more as far as if that's true or anecdotal. I don't know. I mean, because there are atrocities that are remembered, throughout the years. I would think maybe.
What do you mean atrocities?
Well, my whole family history is just one atrocity after another.
Yeah.
But I think most people tend to want to forget those stories, and maybe it's like the Indian princess. Like everyone's got an Indian princess in their in their lineage somewhere. And have you ever heard that?
No.
Oh,
I don't know what you're saying.
I don't know. There's growing up, there was always this joke that everyone was kind of like an eighth Native American and has a Indian princess in their
What's funny
lineage
is
somewhere.
when you said Indian princess, I was thinking of India.
Totally.
Yeah. What is people's infatuation with that? Why does everyone want to have a Native American in their ancestry? Because that is true. Like famously, my grandmother said that she was like half Indian or something. I think that turned out not to be true.
Yeah. I mean, maybe there was, it could be multiple things. I mean, today it's maybe a little bit different explanation, but there may be the exoticness of it, and
right.
I mean, at some points it was, if you were, had African American in you or Native American, that was not looked on as you would hide something like that.
Is
where
that
now it's more
it's inverted.
And we accept that.
People want to opt into those categories. I mean, I think that's true now, but my grandmother said that she had Native American, I think specifically Comanche. But that was in a time where she grew up during the Jim Crow era, so people weren't trying to necessarily opt into minority categories then.
Huh. Yeah, I guess she had a positive, like she didn't have that negative association, I guess maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Why are we talking about this?
Oh, generations and being remembered and how does that happen? And I was just thinking, is it anecdotal that whenever someone builds something that's worth remembering? I mean, you do see this with rich people. They put their names on buildings, and that may be a little bit forced, and then there's other memorials where people make the memorial of the person. And there's other memorials where the person makes the memorial of themselves, which I find super interesting. And also all the people that passed away that were phenomenal people that we just will never know.
Yeah. What do you want to leave behind?
Well, we got 160 episodes of Shores of Ignorance.
True.
So actually, I'm really excited about that part. Like our kids and grandkids and great grandkids. Hopefully, I mean, this will, like, they can always go back and hear what ridiculousness their grandfathers were talking about.
True.
You know, it's
let's just take the moment then to say hello to our great grandchildren.
There you go.
Hey, great grandkids.
Great grandkids. That would be fun to hear that. Like, you know, it's like, I don't think my kids listen. I think they probably listen to a couple episodes or something, you know, and maybe one day they will, maybe they won't. Maybe, because I think like my sister was more the one to dig back into our ancestry. I didn't, I have not found that bug to do that. So,
right.
So I don't know. That's a good question. I might come back to that a little bit, but I mean, I want to build things, and to me, it's not so much about leaving. I'm just curious in general. So I think that's the only reason why I would be disappointed in dying, is that I couldn't discover more things. You know, like for me, like heaven is this place where you still get to discover things.
I was about to ask you, is the idea, so some people hope that after they die, they can understand everything. Like all the things that make no sense. You know, like, for instance, what actually happened with the assassination of JFK, you know? Or did Jeffrey Epstein actually suicide himself?
Yeah.
Not to mention just all the things relationally, like family histories tend to be so fraught with, you don't really know what happened.
Yeah.
You know, what happened with this cousin? What happened with this aunt, this uncle? What happened? I don't really know.
Or the story
Kathy
told,
knew, but she died. And now she, you know, that went with her. And, you know, so this idea that at some point we could know is really infatuating to some people. But for you, I imagine you being incredibly bored by the idea of knowing everything.
Yeah.
Because you love the process of discovery.
Yeah.
That's your meth.
My meth.
Yeah.
Well, so I have no idea what heaven's like, or obviously, but like, or what that means when we die. I tend to believe something carries on and through. What that looks like, I don't know, but my inkling is that there's still more discovery. Yeah. It's just different. But I also believe that we'll never be able to discover the things as we do in the present moment.
I imagine it as something like everything is what it could be.
In its final product, or in its becoming?
In its becoming.
Okay, gotcha.
So it's like, who could you be? Who could I be? I think about heaven as I will be who I am. And there's no more question about who could I be. I can now simply observe who I am. But that doesn't mean that there is no more discovery, because how does who I fully am interact with who you fully are? And how do we interact with who our loved ones fully are? You know, there seems like there's an endless number of things to do once we are fully who we could be.
Even that I have a little bit of a problem with, because when you say like who I, it's again, we're totally just way out here on the but I love thinking about the idea of heaven, because I think whenever you think of heaven and what that could look like, it helps you better to see your present situation better. So I feel like that part I think is helpful. So this sort of like extrapolation into like what is heaven, I think is actually helpful and useful. Because I even have this idea of like with heaven is sort of, it's still a place of becoming. Like you don't know who you are, but you're truly becoming that person. It's like you're always becoming, but you're without maybe some of the restraints of that. For example, I think the elves are sort of that symbol of heavenly beings.
Are we talking
Tolkien,
Will Ferrell or Keebler or Lord of the Rings?
Santa Claus elves,
Yeah.
like Tolkien or more the fantasy genre of elves is, and this would be like my dream, honestly. Like you have these elves that live thousands and thousands of years, and so they can spend a couple of years on woodworking,
right?
Building a sword. This sword took me 150 years. It's like it's not the same concept of time, and it's sort of like as you're working on things, you're also working on yourself too.
Oh, I love that.
I've always
as you're working on things, you're also working on yourself.
Yeah, I like that too. I said that.
Yeah, you did. Cheers.
Cheers to the shores.
I mean, that's so true. When you're working on something, whether it's mechanical or
your marriage,
your relational, your
Mm.
friendships, you are discovering yourself. You are working on yourself. It's almost like what we were talking about at the beginning, like sort of popping out of your framework and your perspective. If you might be working on something really specific, trying to solve a problem, and then you go on a walk and you're not stumped anymore. You figure it out because your mind's engaged on something else. So when you're working on something external, there's some portion of your mental capacity, which is also seeing the way that you respond to it and seeing the way that you struggle with it and fight with it. You're judging yourself, you're celebrating yourself sometimes too. And there's a portion of your brain that's working on all those problems that you don't want to look at. It's working on your marriage. It's working on your relationship with your mom or your dad, your coworker that you always get into bristled conversations with, whatever it may be. When you work on things, you're working on yourself.
Yeah. I always love, there's always sort of these metaphors of, you see this in fantasy novels and other areas as far as the wise blacksmith. There's something about he's pounding on a hammer. He's pounding on metal and making something and folding it. And there's always this sort of wise, like in this one fantasy novel, Aragon, and it's in the inheritance cycle, like he has to build his own sword. And there's something about him building his own sword. It actually, he and like the sword and himself become one. Like there's almost like it's, in a sense, magic is built into it. But it's the same thing you were talking about, I think this last week or the week before, is whenever you build something, or the rocks, that rock is from, Hawaii, and it has meaning to it. So it's like you start to feel part or one with something that you build, and it just kind of reveals things about yourself as far as the struggle. Or I can't think of all the times when I work on something and just thoughts start popping into my head about other stuff that you kind of have to deal with, as far as like you're working on something, you're like, shit, I was such a dick to my kids on that one, or I should have said that to my wife, or it's like something will just pop into your head that you're just like,
Well, it's like that this is sort of a common meme, I think. People talk about how like you're just trying to take a shower, and then all of a sudden you remember that horribly embarrassing thing that you said when you were in third grade. It's like you open up the bandwidth for all the things that you consciously keep out when you engage in something different.
Yeah.
And I love that. I think it's a great thing.
Although,
go ahead.
Sorry. I hate it because like sometimes I'll be walking, and I feel like I have Tourette's syndrome. I'll be like walking, and shit. And I like look around, like, okay, nobody saw that. Cause something will come to my head. I'm like, shit.
Didn't deal with that.
Yeah.
When you were talking about when you make something, you know yourself. It's a really interesting statement. And it made me think about not so much anymore, but for most of my 20s and 30s, I always did all of the mechanical work on my cars. And there's a very unique feeling that you get when you fix a car and then go drive it. Like I remember one time I had this old Suburban, this old piece of shit that I was really low on cash. And I had like $3,000 cash and I bought this Suburban. And it turns out that they advertised it had like 150,000 miles. I think it had something like 350,000 miles. And it was I had my first car ever was this truck, this like 1985 Ford F-150 that ended up getting the nickname the Hunk of Junk. This Suburban was the Chevy version of the Hunk of Junk. And I worked on it a lot. And there was one time I worked on it and I don't remember what I had done, but it was some pretty extensive work on the engine. And then I got it running. And then I took my family and drove them out to Enchanted Rock. And I remember as I was driving, having this feeling of, I know myself and I trust, and I know exactly what's going on in the Suburban. Mm-hmm. I know what the risks are. I know what might fail. I know what's not going to fail because I was in there. And not only do I know this car, I have a confidence about myself that there's a uniqueness to that kind of confidence after you've worked on something. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, sorry, I'm gonna kind of spin it real quick, but what do you kind of want to leave behind? What's your legacy, or what do you want to be remembered for by, or
It's so hard because I wonder if you felt this way when I asked you that, but there's something immediately in me that's like, oh, I don't want to be vain or arrogant and say, essentially, like, I want to be valued. I want to make things that are valued. But it's also, isn't that universal? Mm-hmm. Don't we all want to make things that are valued? I think I want to leave behind the mark of truth on the hearts of those who I'm in relationship with. I want to leave behind what I have learned by living my own story. Maybe that's in the form of the songs that I write. Maybe that's in the form of a book. Maybe that's just this podcast. I don't know. I love the truth. And I love the pursuit of it. I want to leave that behind. I want to share my love of that with people.
Yeah, I like that. Well, I think that's the fun thing. I think you and I are participating in right now is that dialogue. Like there's many people out there. We're all kind of working on like what's going on around us, and I think that's something that you and I are always looking for, those sort of truth sayers or prophets or prophetesses that are looking into the future and looking into humankind or our situation and assessing like what is this? Let me put words to this. Let me kind of suss out the marrow of like what we're kind of living in. And I think that's something that we both really value. And I always think of you as far as like the person with the Gandalf with the staff and like, you shall not pass. like do not let falsehood in here.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Obviously I have a lot of Tolkien references.
Yeah. Can I get a little top off here?
I tried to put it in the middle, but I
couldn't see it.
No, I had it more on my side.
Yeah, you did.
But also, I think that's the great thing about story is that it kind of helps us.
That's good.
Look into the future, because we read these stories like a Tolkien and we see all these different characters, and like like, how are they reacting? What are they doing? How are they moving into the future? We've got a Frodo who's going into certain death for a certain, a certain way of looking at it. Like, he doesn't know he's coming back. And I don't know very few people that want to be the wormwood, who is speaking, absurdities into the king's ear.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if you are that character in real life, nobody watches that character as like, oh, I want to be that guy.
Right, yeah. Everybody wants to be the hero.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And yet the hero is always the one who goes into the unknown at the risk of his own life
Mm-hmm.
and comes back a different person.
Mm-hmm.
Which I guess is, what is that that saying? What you want most exists where you least desire to look.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to resolve ourselves to death and go on that journey, even though we are already on that journey.
Mm-hmm.
We are resolved to die.
Mm-hmm.
It's inevitable. We are on the hero's journey, each and every one of us.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not we choose to recognize that,
Participate in it.
or participate in
Yeah.
it,
Mm-hmm.
is a whole nother issue.
Yeah. I think that's basically what life is saying to us. Do you want to participate?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to do this anyways.
Yeah.
But do you want to participate?
Can I read you something I wrote about that?
Yeah, totally.
Trying to figure out where to start.
What's this from? Or is it something you wrote?
This is from the eulogy that I wrote for my dad.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's all about participation.
Mm-hmm.
On the memorial, wow, that was a lot of ma. On the morning of his memorial service, I struggled to get out of bed. I was reeling from my own thunderstroke, and it felt like getting up and putting my feet on the floor would make me complicit in this reality that I desperately wanted not to be real. But life exists whether you choose to live it. Truth exists whether you choose to believe it. As I laid there thinking about the speech I had planned to give at his service, I tried to imagine the words coming out of my mouth, and it felt like a physical impossibility. How could these be true words? How could this be a true moment? Speech has the power to create, acknowledge, legitimize. I didn't want to lend my tongue to this horrible thing. I imagined my father, bright, measured, playful, and deeply loving, and I realized that it wasn't my belief that was being asked of me by life, but my participation. We wake up and the day seems to say, I hold suffering, but also joy. I hold sadness, but also love. I hold wounding truth, but also tenderness and forgiveness. Do you want to participate? It seemed to me that my father had always said yes to this question.
That's so good.
I love that we landed on that.
Mm-hmm.
It comes back to the idea that everything is relational.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't about truth or belief exactly. It's about participation.
Yeah, participation. It is revelationary, revelatory as far
Mm-hmm.
as like when you're in relationship. We were just talking about earlier in the program was the idea of our kids. They sort of reflect back to you. It's things that are great and things that are not so great, and also being married. There's also things are being reflected back to you. And I think that's something about relationship is it does reflect back to you, and I think that's where truth is discovered whenever action is reflected. You get to see it for more of its true impact. Especially around people that you actually love and care for. I think if you don't really love somebody or care for them, then you don't get a lot of things reflected back to you. It's more of a subject, master and subject kind of relationship, or subject and master.
Say that again. If you don't love someone, then you don't get much reflection from them.
Mm-hmm. Like I was just thinking about, as far as like a master and his slave, there's no real relationship right there. You could say the relationship is master and slave, but it's sort of
neither of them are learning about themselves from the other.
Yeah, and it's saying, master's saying, you are slave, you stay in that category, and here's the boundaries with which we are to interact with. And the slave says, yes, I will interact within those boundaries.
And only within those.
And only within those, because I know if I step out of those boundaries, then therefore I'm punished. And so it's a very authoritarian relationship. But in a relationship of love, there's boundaries, but they're more from self-protection. It's like, I'm in this relationship and I want to do this. However, I know there's areas I can't go just yet, but I want to.
Let's hang on that for a minute, because that's really interesting. In part, by comparing what's wrong with the master-slave relationship, in which there's clear boundaries, and if you cross the boundary, there's punishment. Whereas I think it's very common. So if we take that as like an obviously pathological relationship, and we just look at the idea of boundaries, well, as a relationship gets more loving and more healthy, could you say you have less boundaries? You can play more extensively because the boundaries are removed. And yet it's very popular in current culture, in something like dating relationships, to say, well, you need to have your boundaries. You need to respect my boundaries. You just crossed a boundary.
Well, I think that's a really interesting, because also there's a part of when you're in relationship with somebody and you love them, you do kind of recognize like there is a boundary here and I need to be careful and I need to tread lightly. Because at least in the tone and the way that you presented the other kind of boundary it's basically like, it's you're more telling somebody, I don't want you to know me. Like,
right.
Like, stop. Where the other boundary is like, for example, I might not want to talk about something, and you were like, Michael, man, you really need to talk about this. And you're like, but hey, you're not ready for this right now, or this isn't the time. So it's more of a loving way that you approach that boundary and sort of like step back, and in other instances, you might push on that boundary, and I might get angry or frustrated with you. But the relational part of love is what makes that different, as you get sort of like that, juxtaposition of master slave and a loving relationship with fewer boundaries, because you do see like really loving relationships, the boundaries are very small and low.
Well, and you used the word protection a moment ago. I think you can bring down, well, when you say that you have a boundary, what you're saying is I need to protect myself. But a loving relationship should be engaged in the growth and strength of another person. And if I'm in a loving relationship with you, as we grow and strengthen each other, I have less of a need to protect myself. In part because I know you, and I know that you don't want to injure me. And in part because I'm being strengthened by you, and I don't need to fear injury because I can sustain it.
Yeah.
And so as a relationship grows, the need for boundaries reduces.
Yeah, and then that's where you kind of have these accidental, again, just to use the boundaries, and, when you're playing, sometimes you accidentally like hit somebody in the nose, their nose bleeds, there's that, but
Right.
again, you know the difference between like, oh, we were just playing versus, you wanted to hurt me, I just remember instances as a kid too. It's like, you get into that spot and it all of a sudden gets really serious for a second.
Yeah.
You're almost kind of going at it, but then there's also this part like, wait a minute.
My brother,
Did we just do that? Like
when he was in high school, knocked the 2 front teeth out of his best friend twice. And after the second time, I think his friend's mom wanted to injure my brother. She's like, these dentist bills. But it's funny because, he's still a friend,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
despite that injury.
Is this Mateo or?
No, Chris. He was at my dad's memorial, though.
Okay.
So after all these years, he's still a close friend, not only of my brother, but of my family.
Yeah. That's great. There's also a whole conversation with guys and those kind of relationships.
Yeah. Well, do we feel like we've?
I thought it was good. I really enjoyed it. Not sure
Okay.
exactly where we went to, but
Well, I found that quote that I was talking about at the beginning from
Good.
Jordan Peterson. So why don't I read this and we can leave it there?
okay, cool.
Life is suffering. Love is the desire to see unnecessary suffering ameliorated. Truth is the handmaiden of love. Dialogue is the pathway to truth. Humility is recognition of personal insufficiency and the willingness to learn. To learn is to die voluntarily and be born again in great ways and small. Speech must be untrammeled so that dialogue can take place, so that we can all humbly learn, so that truth can serve love, so that suffering can be ameliorated, so that we can all stumble forward to the kingdom of God. I think that's so beautifully said.
Well
and
done.
really like ties up everything we talked about. So, Mr. Peterson, cheers. Thank you for that.
Thank you guys. All right.
Love you all out there.
Too. Bye.
Thanks for being with us. Bye. Still can't figure out what to do with this cord because when I have it on my back, it gets bound. And